filósofo y teórico social marxista nacido en 1935 en Gillingham, Inglaterra. Es profesor de antropología y geografía en distintas universidades alrededor del mundo y uno de los teóricos sociales más importantes de nuestro tiempo, responsable de algunas de las teorías más interesantes para analizar los problemas sistémicos de nuestro mundo, tales como la teoría del desarrollo geográfico desigual o la teoría de la acumulación por desposesión, así como sus estudios acerca de las miserias del proceso del neoliberalismo o su conceptualización del espacio y la utopía. Es, sin duda, uno de los intelectuales marxistas más reconocidos entre las corrientes del pensamiento crítico contemporáneo y en el campo de las ciencias sociales. Se define a sí mismo como urbanista rojo y afirma que pretende crear ardor de estómago a la bestia del capitalismo. Del capitalismo actual dice que ha mutado, pues antes se trataba de la acumulación y ahora de la desposesión de lo común. Harvey ve al neoliberalismo como un proyecto contrarrevolucionario llevado a cabo por la clase capitalista corporativa, la cual se sentía amenazada tanto política como económicamente hacia finales de la década de los 60 y a lo largo de los 70. Ellos querían implantar un proyecto político que pusiera freno al poder del trabajo, lo que cortaría de raíz los movimientos revolucionarios en gran parte del mundo. Ha sido un extraordinario lector de Marx, lo que le ha servido para poder interpretar con mayor precisión aquello que estudiaba como geógrafo. Estas lecturas fueron una muy buena guía para entender al capitalismo moderno y le mostraron que el análisis de la dinámica de la urbanización permitía comprender lo que sucedía en macroeconomía. Ha sido uno de los principales críticos del excepcionalismo en la geografía, pues lo considera una explicación incorrecta. Reconoce el problema de querer extender el método científico a las ciencias sociales e históricas como la geografía, pero lo ve como una necesidad imperante. Según él, las leyes pueden establecerse igualmente en geografía física y geografía humana. Cree necesaria la consideración de la geografía como una ciencia normal y considera que las teorías deben ser verificables y basadas en un lenguaje matemático. Durante la década de los 70, Harvey se traslada a la Universidad Johns Hopkins en Baltimore, Estados Unidos, y es entonces cuando su carrera da un enorme giro provocado por la situación que vivía ese país en ese momento. Es entonces cuando se une a un movimiento que estaba emergiendo en ese momento, la geografía radical, y especialmente a su desarrollo desde la teoría marxista. En 1973 publica el libro Urbanismo y Desigualdad Social, en donde recopila 6 ensayos que muestran su evolución desde perspectivas liberales de izquierda hasta perspectivas más radicales, cercanas a la tradición marxista. Los temas centrales giran en torno a la ciudad y sus problemas, tales como vivienda, teoría de la renta, gentrificación, entre otros. Este libro supone un hito claro en el desarrollo de la geografía urbana. Entre los muchos libros que ha publicado, destaca La condición de la posmodernidad, una investigación sobre los orígenes del cambio cultural, donde critica el avance de la filosofía posmoderna y analiza su desarrollo como la dimensión cultural del capitalismo tardío. El conflicto terrorista islámico, además del ataque y la consiguiente reacción de Estados Unidos, provocan la publicación de El Nuevo Imperialismo, obra en la que Harvey expone la importancia adquirida por la acumulación por desposesión, la cual considera como un proceso de colonización de nuevos yacimientos de recursos para los capitalistas, desde los servicios de agua, electricidad, vivienda o salud, hasta la apropiación de los más diversos recursos naturales y el despojo de millones de pequeños propietarios y comunidades en todo el mundo, de tal manera que todo trabajo y todo recurso sea para enriquecer al capital. Argumenta además que la guerra con Irak ha permitido a los neoconservadores de Estados Unidos desviar la atención de los graves problemas económicos de ese país. En uno de sus trabajos más recientes, el libro Breve Historia del Neoliberalismo examina histórica y geográficamente la teoría y práctica del neoliberalismo desde mediados de los años 70. Considera que este fue una respuesta a la crisis de acumulación sufrida por el capitalismo, lo que significó una baja en los rendimientos de las inversiones, a la vez de un incremento de las luchas sociales. Para Harvey, el neoliberalismo ha tenido éxito en incrementar el capital y el poder de los estratos altos de la sociedad, pero ha ampliado la brecha entre estos y las mayorías empobrecidas, poniendo en primera plana, otra vez, la lucha de clases. Es Además, un gran estudioso sobre temas de urbanismo y aborda el tema del derecho a la ciudad. Señala que el concepto de derecho a la ciudad surge primordialmente de las calles, como un grito de socorro de gente oprimida en tiempos desesperados. Por lo que se encarga de estudiar a las movilizaciones sociales que tienen lugar en lo que denomina ciudades rebeldes, como una exigencia y reclamo de parte de estas ciudades ante el avance del cercamiento urbano que realiza el capitalismo. Harvey entiende el derecho a la ciudad como una categoría de movilización política o un derecho colectivo que busca cambiar y reinventar la ciudad de acuerdo con los deseos de las y los ciudadanos. Piensa que la reinvención de la ciudad depende inevitablemente del ejercicio de un poder colectivo sobre el proceso de urbanización, por lo que lo considera un derecho más colectivo que individual. Lo define como un derecho a reconstruir y volver a crear la ciudad como un cuerpo político socialista, para así erradicar la pobreza y la desigualdad, y sobre todo, poner freno a la degradación medioambiental. Es, según sus propias palabras, la libertad para hacer y rehacernos a nosotros mismos y a nuestras ciudades.
Professor Harvey, thank you for having this conversation with us here at Capital 21, the Mexican public television, here at Mexico City. One of the main elements of the fourth transformation that's going on here in Mexico City is trying to empower, to strengthen the public. And here's what we're going to do. Now, we have to thank also the Mexico City government and also the Ministry of Culture here at Mexico City, the mayor, the Doctora Claudia Sheinbaum Pardo, and Minister Claudia Curiel Icaza. We would like to talk about 4 different subjects that are quite related between each other. We would like to talk about citizen inequality, the media, the role of the media and the narrative of the neoliberalism, the role of the state after COVID-19, after the pandemic, and democracy. So, all this in the context of the neoliberalism, the global neoliberalism. So let's start with the urban matters, if you like. It seems more and more that cities have become a place of conflict and a place of inequality. Why do you think this happens?
Well, I don't think they're becoming, they have always been. And it comes in waves. Social movements in the cities were very strong in the 1960s, 1970s. Then they dissipated somewhat. They became more environmentally focused. And in recent times, I think there's been more and more resistance at ground level to what might be called the predatory practices of contemporary capitalism, which is using the cities, in my view, as a sort of dumping ground for surplus capital. And so one of the things we're seeing is a development process in many cities which is about absorbing surplus capital and building meaningless projects, mega projects. And it seems like one of the things I want to dissuade mayors from doing is succumbing to some mega project which is not going to really help the well-being of the mass of the people, though it will, of course, provide some kind of employment. So today we find anti-gentrification movements all around the place, and quality of life movements, and quality of education movements, things of that kind. It's more about, if you like, the delivery of what we would call a social wage. Which is the benefits that come to the mass of the population through the state, and of course fights over that are very strong right now. So the nature of the struggles have changed, but I think that it's always been there. There's always been fights going on. If the city, actually, what makes cities very interesting is there's always some good fights going on.
Usually you speak about the paradox in the cities between capital and basically the rights of the people. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, one of the themes which is very important to me right today is to talk about how does capital absorb the mass of its capital. That if you looked at the global economy back in 1970, it was, I don't know, I'll give figures off there, may be wrong, but it was something like $4 trillion global. It's now $40 trillion. And how are you going to find new investment opportunities for $40 trillion? And we went through a building boom and it crashed in 2007, 2008, but it was rescued by a huge building boom in China. China was an absolutely astonishing building boom. They built like crazy and they rescued global capitalism by building cities, whole new cities with nobody living in it. I mean, it was just an astonishing kind of thing. So you kind of go, well, you know, this is the Chinese showing a way to absorb the surplus capital in urbanization and infrastructure development. Now, some of it may be good, and we'll see what happens to the Chinese situation. But if you kind of then say, well, okay, they're now in difficulty, which they are to some degree, because all their developers are going bankrupt and so on. So who's going to rescue capital this time? What kind of urban development project is it going to be? And you start to see some of that in what I call sort of mindless urbanization, which is being orchestrated by big capital developers because they want the business. And they basically make the thing and they get the profit out of making the thing, and then they walk away from it. So that if the thing is useless, it doesn't matter to them. So they like to build what we call bridges to nowhere.
Another thing that you usually mention is that cities have become a place where you can invest, or a paradise to investment, or in a place to live in, and which is basically true wherever. But can you tell us what is the root of this?
Well, you know, in 200 years ago, a big battle was fought within capitals. Who had the power? The industrial capitalists, the merchant capitalists, or the finance capitalists, or the rentiers? And in a sense, the industrialists won. But towards the end of the last century, what we started to see was the rentiers were coming back. And the rentiers are now much more powerful than the industrialists. And the merchant capitalists. I mean, a firm like like Apple is really a merchant capitalist firm, which pirates on industrial capital in Taiwan and back down. So we've got a different kind of capitalist power right now. It's no longer the industrialists who run the system. It's essentially the rentiers. And one of the places the rentiers like to get their rents is from urban property. And so if you look at the wealth of the top 1%, like Piketty, the French economist, does, what you see is that a lot of that wealth is in land and property. Yep. And so this becomes a very, very strong area of investment. And so, you know, speculating in land values starts to become a very, very viable thing for financiers to do and for people to do. And you get more out of it than you do out of building things and making things. So in effect, we move to a capital, a system of capital which is about extracting wealth as much as it is creating it. And a lot of the extraction of wealth is occurring in cities.
Professor Harvey, in Mexico City, mainly in the suburban area, we have a lot of empty houses at the same time that we have a lot of homeless people.
Yes.
How is that possible?
Oh, that's very easily. I mean, my answer to this is again and again simple. 50% of the population in most parts of the world, and probably here it's even larger, 50% of the population cannot afford market housing. Okay? They have not the money to buy it, and they can't rent it. So 50% of the population. We live in a society that says all housing should be built by the market, and maybe some subsidies here, there, and everywhere. Yeah. And if you insist on having a system which is market-based to build housing, then you're not going to meet the needs of the bottom 50% of the population, who are going to actually, create exactly the situation that you're talking about, which is, a surplus of housing for the ultra-rich and a deficit of housing. Now, the answer is very simple, which is you've got to have a big public housing program, whether it's done by associations, local associations, or local governments, or whatever it is, but it has to be a completely different system of housing production and delivery, which is going to meet the needs of the people. Housing policy right now meets the needs of the top 50%, does beautifully. It's building these fantastic kind of things in New York City all over the place for the top 50%, but we have a crisis of affordable housing and 60,000 homeless people. And you say, well, look, why don't people understand that contradiction and do something about it, which is very simple, which is either you have to subsidize the bottom 50% in some way, or you build housing for them. Which at one time in Britain, for example, there was a wonderful public housing program. It had its problems, but it was a very post 1945, where they built massive amounts of estate housing for the population, and in some cities, 60 or 70% of the housing was social housing, until Margaret Thatcher came along and privatized it all, and now creates a situation exactly what you're talking about, of surplus housing for the affluent and deficit of affordable housing for the poor. It's a simple problem, and it has a simple answer. Nobody is prepared to take the simple answer.
Professor, as one of the consequences of neoliberalism in the recent years has been the privatization of public services and public goods. Recently, we heard that, in Wall Street, they were going to invest in water as a commodity and not as a public good. What do you think about that?
Well, the privatization of water supply issue has been going on for quite a considerable time. The situations have arisen where the privatization sort of worked reasonably well. But if it worked very well, it recognized two things. Firstly, the provision of water is a monopoly. And as a monopoly, it has to be, therefore, tightly regulated. And so the regulatory apparatus, so that the pricing was going to be controlled by a regulatory body. The delivery was going to be also by a regulatory body. So you can find examples like France, for example, where most of the water is privatized, but it works quite well in terms of actually getting the water to people, because it has a very, very strong regulatory structure around it. Strong state around it, and a strong regulatory structure around it. So I'm not going to say everything has to be kind of socially. I'm going to say, well, however it's provided, it has to be, no, because if we can get dogmatic and say the answer is nationalization, or the answer is public control. Well, public control can sometimes be a disaster, and there are some examples of public control which has gone very wrong, partly because those who provide the goods for the public authority, there's a lot of corruption. So if you look at, for instance, the scandal around Odebrecht, which
quite popular in Latin America.
Yes, right. But that's the sort of scandal that can happen with some public provision in the background. So be careful about saying the answer is simply public provision. But it is, I think, finding a way to get the water to people. Now, Wall Street, of course, is looking at things and saying, well, what are the commodities that are going to be scarce in the future? Well, water is turning into one. And we've had water crises in South Africa. We've seen them, Sao Paulo running out, and now Los Angeles is in problems, and you have problems in Monterey. You know, these are the sorts of issues. So Wall Street says, well, that's scarce, and scarce you can start to exact a monopoly price. So Wall Street is supporting that. It's also supporting land grabbing, which is taking over of land and property and so on wherever it can. So it's moving back into a rentier kind of position. That is, we don't have to do anything because water is scarce, and so it's the scarcity which will allow us to extract money from it.
Professor Harvey, Mexico is a very rich country. We have a lot of natural resources. How do we become from the great capital to the great village here in Mexico? How is that possible?
I think that, again, look, again, there's some very simple things you can think about this. I mean, the whole natural resource base in any country is something that needs to be managed coherently. The rates of extraction have to be long-term, not short-term. There is a tendency for resource mining. You know, you go in and you take all the resources and get out. Well, you have to control that. So there was, you know, in the New Deal of the 1930s in the United States, something emerged called a National Resources Planning Board, which attempted to look at the totality of the resources of the United States, its mineral resources, its agricultural resources, energy resources, and try to think about ways of managing it and producing things. And it produced some wonderful things, by the way. For instance, electrification, rural electrification in the 1930s was done on a communal basis. It was not done by sort of capitalist firms. It was done community by community by community. And we have things like the Tennessee Valley Authority, which was a kind of a public authority which was providing electricity. So you could set up a National Resources Planning Board and try to think about the optimal way in which the resources can be developed in relationship to economic development. Now, part of the problem right now, as I've mentioned, is that the spiral form of economic development is sort of, you know, going to push you. You're going to have to try to control that. And the way you do that is you control it through this. There are some examples of countries that have done a little that way, like Norway has with the oil. They are very careful about the oil revenues. They have a big kind of fund which they get for the oil revenues, and so the money is kept, doesn't sort of float out to Wall Street immediately. It remains within the power of the state. So there are many things that can be done of that sort, and I think that in that way it's possible to plan extraction, and because we need copper, we need lithium, we need these things, you know, and to the degree we want to have artificial intelligence, we need the kinds of things, the chips and the minerals that go into the chips. You know, there's a fantasy that there's something that is oppressive on the economy. That's fantasy. Obviously, we are going to extract things from the economy. We have to do so because popular needs, but we do it in as organized and rational way as possible, and we deal with the corruptions like the Odebrecht and all of that as we go along.
Okay, a little example. Now in Mexico City and in all of our country, we have a semi-fixed price for the gas for the cars to move, and it's more expensive in the United States of America than it is in Mexico because we put away some taxes. What do you think about that action of the Mexican government?
Well, this is a very touchy, difficult thing. You raise oil prices to be close to the market, you'll get a social movement against you. Huge. Because most of the people in the population very much rely upon cheap gas. It is a part of the social wage to have cheap gas. And you have to treat it that way and say, well, if you're going to change the social wage by making it market-driven, which you might want to do for environmental reasons, this is a very delicate problem. And what you've seen is, in France, when this happened, the Yellow Jackets took place. You've seen movements in Brazil against sudden rises in energy prices, in Ecuador as well. And we've seen, so again, it's very, very careful about what you do there. And you have to understand that something of this kind, yes, environmentally it's not good. To have cheap gas, because then global warming comes. So you want at some point or other to make it more expensive. But if you make it more expensive, you are cutting into the social wage of the mass of the population, which was going to produce a mass movement of some sort. So you know that it's something that we Marxists talk about when we talk about contradiction. And if we lived in a world with no contradictions, it wouldn't be interesting. This is a very, very interesting contradiction.
¿Habías visto un muerto al menos?
2 veces. A mi jefe cuando se murió y a un señor en la calle.
Para atrás.
Llévate el coche, pero déjanos la cabeza.
Los Hermosos Vencidos. Sábado, 22 horas. Por Canal 14.
Este domingo, programación especial. Ayotzinapa, crimen de Estado.
Somos el TCDMX. Y seguro nos conoces por qué.
Somos el árbitro antes, durante y después de una elección en la Ciudad de México.
Verificamos las decisiones en pueblos y barrios originarios, partidos políticos
y de participación ciudadana.
Date cuenta, protegemos tus derechos político-electorales.
Tribunal Electoral de la Ciudad de México, garantizando justicia en tu elección.
Esta noche me la llevo porque esta pasión me mata.
¿Seguro que sí? Sí. Así le hemos cantado tú y yo.
Yo ya me voy. A morir a los desiertos. Domingo, 15 horas. Por Canal 14.
It's a really thin line also. Moving to other subjects like the role of the media in the neoliberalism, in the neoliberal area. Neoliberalism didn't land just out of the blue. It landed and it got tangible in our cities with some company, which is the media. The role of the media in the narrative of the neoliberalism, it's quite important for getting consent in the population. We heard many times here in Mexico City private is way better than public. For instance, education, health service, and we heard many things like poor people, they are poor because they don't work, because they are lazy, because they don't get education because they don't want to, basically. And what do you think about the role of the media in getting this narrative to generate consent, as Herman and Chomsky mentioned sometime?
Yeah, well, I think the media has been increasingly subject to monopoly control. There came a fantasy in the early 1990s that social media would escape that monopoly control, but in fact it is not. It started out as sort of peer-to-peer computing, and all the anarchists got into it, and it was kind of, there was a sort of social media utopia around on the left, and then it quickly got captured, of course, entirely by the big corporations, and now, in effect, the big corporations are living off our labor because we produce the information which the big corporations basically mine and sell. So the media has a particular structure, which it seems to me is, it's monopoly capital at work, and therefore it engages in a process that I find is very interesting to think about, which is what I would call repressive tolerance. Which is something that Herbert Marcuse and others talked about, which says essentially, you give the idea that there's a place of debate, and people have debate and freedom and discussion, but there are clear boundaries. And those clear boundaries are such that, for myself, okay, I'm a very well-known Marxist, but there's no way any major media in the United States would ever have me on to give opinion about anything. No way.
You're basically banned.
I'm banned. Yeah, I'm the repressive tolerance boundary is there, and I'm over here. And I'm a big fight to trying to get. And the one time I did get on there, I found myself interviewed in a very supercilious way. I was kind of, to begin with, I was called the Marxist geographer. Well, geography is not exactly a big reputation subject. I'm not even an economist or anything, like Marxist geographer. What? And a Marxist geographer. And well, you kind of go. Before the interview started, I kind of realized the whole game was up before it started.
Well, this is the beauty of public media here in Mexico, that we can speak freely about any subject, especially with you.
Yes, no, I used to get interviewed in Spain, but I don't get interviewed in Spain anymore because that has become completely mediatized. And of course Brazil. There's. So yeah, the media is a real problem, and it doesn't, however, deal with that audience, which I think historically has been very important, which are the self-taught people, the autodidacts. When Marx was writing, 60 or 70% of the proletariat was illiterate, but the part that was literate was self-taught. They were not actually put in formal education, and because they were not formally educated, they were extremely open to new ideas and new possibilities. And so you look at the kind of audience that Marx was writing, and I say this these days, while it's very difficult to get undergraduates to read Capital because it's too difficult a book, the autodidacts loved it. They loved it back then, and so Marx knew who he was writing for. It was the artisans who were teaching themselves, and they were fantastic. I mean, when Tom Paine put out his thing on the rights of man, all the printing houses in Britain and the United States reproduced it, and hundreds of thousands of copies were out in a few days. It was fantastic. But there was an audience there for it. And the problem right now is we have formally educated people so that, again, repressive tolerance. I can teach, I'm about the one person in New York City who still teaches Marx's Capital. You kind of go, well, everybody else is kind of saying, well, Marx had some interesting ideas, but, it was all wrong. The theory of, the theory of value is all kind of, something like that. And they go on. When the crisis came in 2007, 2008, a lot of people were saying, well, maybe Marx was right, but they didn't know what Marx said. And when I tried to say, well, Marx actually said, no, we don't want to know that. So there's and also there's a class division here. I mean, education is now so class divided. I mean, I know in Latin America it is, the private sector and so on, and even in places like, Argentina, where it's still free, and of course it's money was needed in Chile and so on. So that's a real problem. In the United States, we have two educational systems: one for the privileged elites, and the other for the mass of the population. Two different funding streams. The elites do very well, and same true higher education. In higher education, people will come and say, we're going to give you $20 million to give a course on humanities. Please don't mention Marx. Please don't mention critical race theory.
Well, talking about what can we mention and what can we not mention, here in Mexico, the President Andrés Manuel López Obrador offered a daily early conference just to fight against the hegemonic media narrative. What do you think about that transparency exercise?
I think that's good. I mean, this is what Correa did in Ecuador too, and it could be very, very effective. But again, what we're really looking for is a kind of a movement that does more than just that. I mean, I think what he's doing is terribly important. I'm very glad to hear he's doing it. I hope it's effective, and I think that this is something that I'd be very interested to know exactly what the content is of what it is that he's looking for, because my impression is he's in what I call the redistributive socialism kind of which is a position on the left right now, which is consolidating, I think. It has people like Bernie Sanders, Piketty in France, and so on, Boric in Chile, and Labrador here, I think, are kind of moving in that direction, which is to say, look, things have become so biased that we need to redistribute to some degree as much wealth as we can, either through public policies or through taxation or through something of that kind. So there is I think a movement around in the world which is, if you like, redistributive socialism, and I'm all in favor of movements which make life better for even 10 or 15% of the population. I'm all in favor of that. But Marx's kind of critique was that if you're just about redistributive socialism and you don't actually get to the means of production and the whole production apparatus, then you're only dealing with half of the story, and I think that's the case. But I'm very happy that half of the story is there.
One of the main things that Juan mentioned is that the president defunded the private media, because they used to receive approximately around $300 million every year. Mm-hmm. So he cut that fund to distribute that money in public services, public programs.
Journalists, social care for journalists.
Great.
That budget.
Great.
Great.
So now continue with let's continue to talk about the language. Here we are looking at a time and a special place here in Mexico City, because we are now trying to redefine some terms. we used to think about austerity as defunding the public services, but now in Mexico, austerity means trying to get cutbacks on some of the in some of the bureaucracy, because we used to have a huge bureaucracy, to try to make some more efficient state, and giving that money to scholarships, to social programs, to generate well-being. And austerity now is way different than austerity in Europe, which means defunding public investment. What do you think about this special moment where neoliberalism, especially after the pandemic, is being questioned in some areas, in some terms that used to mean things like austerity or like competitivity or other terms are now in debate?
Yeah, this is an interesting kind of thing. Every country, it seems to me, or has its own kind of set of particular problems with which it has to deal. And you have to deal with those because they are what exist. And here you're talking about, okay, what to do about a bloated bureaucracy, where a lot of problems arise because things get blocked within the bureaucracy, which leads to the possibility of bypassing and corruption and all kinds of things. So you have a problem of that sort which you need to address. In the United States, we don't have that problem so much. A bit of it, but no. But our problem is the lopsidedness of institutions. The fact that 20% of the population elect 60% of the representatives of the Senate. And the result is, of course, complete bias in what the Senate will or will not approve. And interestingly, that 60% comes from those areas of the country which aren't producing anything. So even the conventional Wall Street people kind of say this is a bit of a problem because you're not supporting. I mean, there's an irony. New York produces a huge amount of wealth and gets back very little of it from the federal government. All those states which are criticizing government and so on are actually getting back far more wealth. And if New York suddenly said it was going to get back, insist it gets back what it produces, the whole country would be in a total mess. So yeah, we have our problems too. And so it doesn't surprise me that there is some necessity to push from this, because my own limited experiences with Mexican bureaucracy have not been very encouraging. So, good. I think that but I think that austerity is again a general argument which exists within neoliberalism and which is part of the neoliberal credo. So I think it is very important to recognize that I would not want to call it austerity in relationship to the problem you're talking about. I would talk about it as rationalization of...
Basically, that's what it is, yes.
Yes, and I would rather talk about it in those terms rather than saying this is a form of austerity which we want to impose. I would kind of say that we need rationalization. Or like I was kind of saying, I think a National Resources Planning Board might be a good idea to kind of think about.
That's the main difference between neoliberal austerity and what we call in Mexico Republican austerity.
Okay. All right. Yeah.
And do you think that Republican austerity is enough to stop a rich government with a poor population?
No, the only thing that's going to stop a rich government is a poor population organising structures of solidarity that can actually make sure
Has happened that in Mexico?
I don't know. I don't know. I mean, that's the kind of thing you can tell me rather than I can tell you. I have no idea. But I think that's very interesting.
Oh, we changed the government and the model.
Yes. No. I think, but you know, how it's working is on the ground, and at some point or other, it seems to me that the mobilization of populations behind what you're doing is kind of crucial.
A lot of rich people are angry. Yeah. I think that's a good thing.
I think that's a very good thing, and particularly if they're angry and disempowered. But if they're not, unfortunately, disempowered.
That's why they are angry.
Yes.
Now, speaking about democracy, do you think democracy changed after the pandemic? Well, we are still at the last part of the pandemic, we hope. But do you think the pandemic changed something in democracy?
Well, I would like to think that it did, but unfortunately, depending upon where you are in the world, the pandemic confirmed not only some of the best aspects of society, but also confirmed some of the worst aspects. I think the pandemic in the United States was politicized very early on. It was used politically. All this stuff about using or not using masks and individual liberty and all those kinds of things. I mean, it was used politically. Trump politicized it in a certain kind of way. And I think did some things which are threatening to democracy in the process. And you know, this idea that democracy is about individual liberty, and individual liberty is God-given and sacrosanct, and therefore, by definition, democracy is contingent upon that individual right, and you know, that kind of model of society, which has become very popular within 30 or 40% of the population in the United States. That vision of society seems to me at some point points you into authoritarian non-democracy, which we are seeing examples of that in Europe, in Orban and Poland and so on, and Bolsonaro, of course, in Brazil.
Professor, where do you think that Mexico lead with the pandemic in a better way than other countries that are called the countries of rights and the countries of liberty, like the United States of America?
Yes, I haven't got a good idea exactly how the pandemic occurred here.
Not that many deaths with very serious health problem in Mexico with overhigh and diabetes. And also the economic results, our currency is very healthy today. Importations and exportations are also low. And we have the 99% of our population with 3 vaccines.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, and in the United States of America, they have serious problems.
Yeah. Well, there's 2 things there. One is I'd be very interested to know more about the way in which the public health system in Mexico confronted
in the past. But now it's taken care of.
Well, what we're seeing in the United States is a recognition that the public health system, which was privatized in all those ways, was failing to confront the pandemic, independent of the popular resistance, there's a public health failure problem, which people began to find ways to correct, maybe on a state basis, but not very well. And I think that there is a recognition that an event like this requires a coordinated public health system which is nationwide and which can respond adequately to it, and that it failed. Even with all the superiority of the vaccines and all that kind of stuff, that the technical side was very strong, but the organizational side has been very bad, and the popular side has been very bad. So that I think that in the United States we're not seeing a widespread reform of the public health system. So if you see some of that going on here and it has worked here, then that is something which we should look to.
As you mentioned before, do you think there's a reflection about the role of the public services, about the state after the pandemic, after what we saw?
Oh, again, what the response has been here globally, I think there's a widespread recognition that what should be early warning systems didn't work. What was the totally different way in which the Chinese responded to it. Well, it has had its very negative side, which is being popularized, of course, in the West. They were authoritarian and all the rest of it. On the other hand, they had very few deaths. And here we are in the United States kind of saying we have an optimal system and we have 1 million deaths, I mean, what is this? And I think that this differential response to the pandemic from one country to another has a lot of lessons, and I hope that we will learn from it. But in the United States, I don't see people learning from it.
We saw the inequality rise during the pandemic, and especially when Jeff Bezos launched a rocket to the moon, which was kind of like an insult to the people, to the poor people around the world. What do you think about that type of action?
Well, there was a movement at the time to deny Jeff Bezos permission to land. And I think that says a lot about popular opinion about that. Yeah, no, I mean, again, one of the issues I'm very caught up with these days is that capital has so much in the way of surplus. And the centralization of capital has proceeded to levels which are just astronomical. And Jeff Bezos is on the top of that. Yes, astronomical. Yes, that's a good point. Yes, I don't see anybody kind of addressing what seem to me to be real foundational questions. How are we going to deal with 3% or 7% compound rate of growth for the next 100 years, when we're at the point where clearly all the environmental aggregates are stressed. We are finding, water shortages here, droughts there, floods somewhere else, fire somewhere. I mean, the whole thing is the planet is sort of almost on fire, and we're not dealing with the fact that you cannot maintain this rate of growth very much into the future. And therefore, there's these problems of surpluses, vast surpluses of capital, which are sitting there waiting for viable employment. Now, to me, one of the things to do is to take all those surpluses and put it towards the development of all of these infrastructures, which are required in public health. Help solve the affordable housing problem, deal with the inequalities of the educational system, fund things. I mean, in other words, all of that surplus could be extracted from where it is, but the system will not allow it. And politically, the system is very much, I don't know how it's not this way here, but in the United States, big capital wants Washington to be dysfunctional. It doesn't want Washington to do anything. So it's actually likes the fact that there's gridlock and nothing can get past. That's great for Wall Street. It's great for the big corporations because it means
for the NRA,
NRA or whoever. It's great. The status quo.
Professor, we are almost finished. One last question.
Yes.
Latin America is looking and moving from the right to the left.
Yes.
Is that a symptom of the decadence of an empire of capitalism?
I don't think it's no, it's not. It's not a decadence. I wish it was. It's decadence. It's not. It's decadence.
Okay.
What it is that people are recognizing that you cannot take care and make serve the needs of the mass of the population with the political economic system that we now have, and that we need an alternative. Nobody is very clear what the alternative is. There are lots of ideas out there, lots of movements out there, trying out something rather different. But it seems to me that it was always the case in Latin America that the counter-revolution, the neoliberal, there was the neoliberalism and then there was the counter-neoliberal movement, the pink tide. Then you get the counter of the counter, and now you've got the counter of the counter. So but my point is that when a lot of people started to say the left is dead 5-10 years ago, and then all of a sudden people are saying, oh no, it's not. I was saying 5 or 10 years ago, no, you've got a base here, and that base is going to organize a comeback. And so we're beginning to see that, and I think that I have hope for what will happen in Brazil. And I think I will have hope also for the continuation of what is happening here in Mexico. And I would think that the evidence in Mexico is that there is a pathway towards something rather different.
Okay, Professor Harvey, thank you very much.
Thank you, and I hope that things happen here in the way you say.
Thank you very much, and to conversate with the Mexican City population in Capital 21, the Mexican City Public Network. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes.
Entonces, podemos estar hablando hipotéticamente del montaje de una investigación cuya responsabilidad es el Estado mexicano.
Hay un intento, sí, de culpabilizar a las víctimas. Lo he visto en Guatemala, lo he